It was a lively Friday night at the Grand Oak, one of Los Angeles's most celebrated fine dining destinations. The restaurant was alive with energy as the city's elite filled its beautifully decorated dining room. Tech entrepreneurs in tailored suits exchanged ideas over glasses of aged Cabernet, while influencers, with their perfectly curated looks, angled their phones for the perfect shot of their golden-plated desserts. In another corner, a family dressed in timeless elegance shared laughs over their weekly dinner tradition. Amid this glamorous scene, an older man sat quietly at a corner table, his presence so unassuming that most of the bustling crowd barely noticed him. Dressed in a simple gray polo shirt and well-worn slacks, he appeared completely out of place among the glittering crowd. He sipped a glass of whiskey with a calm air, his posture relaxed and unbothered by the luxury around him. To an untrained eye, he might have seemed like a man who had wandered into the wrong place. Yet, this unassuming figure was none other than Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director who had inspired generations. But tonight, no one recognized him, and he preferred it that way. Among the staff working the floor that evening was Rachel, a bright and ambitious waitress in her late 20s. Rachel had been hired just a few months prior and carried herself with a confidence that came from years of hospitality training. With her sleek attire, practiced charm, and aspirations to become a social media influencer, Rachel had spent most of her shift attending to the restaurant's wealthiest and most well-known guests. She eagerly responded to the call of influencers, basking in their gratitude for a welcome-posed table shot or expertly described wine pairing. Her focus on prestige and status, however, blinded her to the man sitting quietly in her section. To Rachel, Clint didn't belong. His casual attire and low profile clashed with the pristine image she believed the Grand Oak represented. She couldn't fathom why someone like him would choose to dine there, let alone occupy a prime table on one of the busiest nights of the week. As she moved between tables, ensuring every high-profile guest received her best service, her gaze lingered on Clint. Each time she passed, her irritation grew. Why was he here? Did he even understand the exclusivity of this place? And why was he only sipping on a glass of house whiskey? What Rachel didn't know, what no one else in the room knew, was that Clint Eastwood wasn't just another customer that evening. 6 months earlier, he had quietly purchased the Grand Oak. To Clint, the restaurant was more than just a high-end dining establishment. It represented something deeply personal. Decades ago, before he became a household name, Clint had dined at the Grand Oak. Back then, it wasn't the luxury or the exclusivity that drew him in. It was the way the staff treated every customer, no matter their background or appearance, with genuine warmth and respect. The place had left a lasting impression on him. When Clint heard that the restaurant was up for sale, he seized the opportunity to preserve the spirit that had made it special. His only request to the staff after taking ownership was simple: treat him like anyone else. He wanted to experience firsthand how guests were treated, not as a celebrity or a legend, but as an ordinary person. What Clint didn't anticipate was how that philosophy would be challenged tonight. As Rachel passed by Clint's table again, her patience finally wore thin. She approached him with her best practice smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice laced with politeness that barely masked her condescension. "I couldn't help but notice you've been nursing that whiskey for a while. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the bar?" Her words hung in the air, polite enough to sound professional, but sharp enough to suggest he didn't belong. Clint glanced up at her, his calm demeanor unshaken. His piercing eyes met hers with the quiet confidence that had graced movie screens for decades. "I'm comfortable here. Thank you," he replied simply, taking another unhurried sip of his whiskey. Rachel's polite facade faltered. She glanced at the nearby host stand, where a group of young tech executives were waiting for a table. Her irritation grew. "Sir," she continued, her tone firmer now, "our chef prepares an exclusive menu here. The prices reflect the caliber of our establishment." She paused, her eyes sweeping over Clint's casual clothes as if to make her point clear. "Are you sure this is the right place for you?" At a nearby table, an older couple who had been regulars for years exchanged uneasy glances. They recognized Clint immediately and could sense the growing tension. The husband began to speak. but his wife placed a gentle hand on his arm, silently urging him to wait. They knew Clint well enough to know that he would handle the situation in his own time. Meanwhile, a young busboy named Miguel had been watching the scene unfold from a distance. Miguel, who had recently immigrated from Mexico and worked tirelessly to support his family, recognized Clint instantly. He had grown up watching Clint Eastwood movies with his father and admired the man for the strength and integrity he portrayed on screen. Seeing Rachel's behavior filled him with a mix of anger and anxiety. His hands tightened around the bus tub he was carrying, and he debated whether to step in. But he was just a busboy. What could he do? Rachel, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension in the room, doubled down. She pulled out her order pad with a sharp flick. "Shall I explain the menu to you, sir?" Slowly. "Perhaps?" she asked, her tone dripping with mock politeness. The jab at Clint's age wasn't lost on anyone within earshot. Miguel, unable to stay silent any longer, took a step forward. "Miss Rachel," he said softly, his voice trembling but resolute. "Maybe I should call Mr. Thomas?" Rachel turned to him, her expression hardening. "Stay out of this, Miguel," she snapped. "Go bus tables. That's what you're here for." Clint watched the exchange with quiet interest, his calm exterior betraying none of the frustration he must have felt. Setting his glass down deliberately, he finally spoke. "In my day," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the tense air, "places like this weren't about appearances. They were about respect." Rachel crossed her arms, her irritation boiling over. "Well, times have changed," she replied. "This is the Grand Oak. Our clientele expects a certain ambience, and quite frankly, you're not meeting it." At that moment, Miguel's bus tub slipped from his hands, crashing to the floor with a loud clang. The older couple gasped audibly, and the room fell silent. All eyes turned to Clint, whose expression remained calm but unreadable. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Rachel's evening had started off seamlessly, with the polished air of someone who had mastered the art of catering to the elite. She floated from table to table, her smile unwavering and her movements precise. The Grand Oaks dining room was alive with its usual Friday night buzz. Young entrepreneurs discussing deals over imported wine, social media influencers snapping photos of intricate desserts, and seasoned patrons enjoying the quiet luxury of their favorite meals. For Rachel, the night felt like an opportunity to shine. Her eyes lingered on high-profile guests, calculating which interactions might boost her budding reputation in hospitality. But every so often, her gaze drifted toward one corner of the room. There, seated alone at a prime table, was a man who seemed completely out of place, dressed in a plain gray polo shirt and casual slacks. He nursed a glass of house whiskey, exuding a calmness that was both effortless and unbothered. Rachel couldn't understand it. How had this man even secured a table in this setting, especially without the polished appearance of her other guests? To her, he was wasting space, occupying a spot that could have been given to someone more deserving, someone who fit the image of the Grand Oak. She brushed off her unease at first, focusing on her influential guests. But as the night wore on and the man remained rooted at the table, her irritation began to simmer. Finally, after serving a table of influencers who offered her the possibility of a tag in their next post, Rachel decided it was time to confront the underdressed guest. Adjusting her apron and summoning her best practice smile, she approached his table, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Excuse me, sir," Rachel began, her tone sweet but undeniably strained. She gestured toward his whiskey glass, her eyebrow arching slightly. "I couldn't help but notice you've been enjoying that drink for quite some time. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the bar." The man looked up from his drink, meeting her gaze with a calm, steady demeanor. There was something about his eyes, sharp, observant, and unshaken, that hinted at a lifetime of experience. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that revealed nothing but carried an air of quiet authority. "I'm quite comfortable here. Thank you," he said simply, before taking another measured sip of his drink. Rachel's practiced smile faltered. For a moment, she hesitated, thrown off by his calm response. But the sight of a group of tech executives waiting near the host stand reignited her determination. She glanced at her watch, her frustration now barely concealed. "Sir," she said, her tone shifting to one of polite condescension, "our executive chef prepares an exclusive menu here. The prices reflect the caliber of our establishment." Her eyes swept over his attire with an air of judgment, making her meaning abundantly clear. Nearby, a young busboy named Miguel had been watching the exchange. Though he had only worked at the Grand Oak for a year, Miguel had already proven himself to be diligent and observant. And tonight, he noticed something Rachel hadn't. The man in the polo shirt wasn't just a regular customer, he was Clint Eastwood. Miguel's heart raced as he recognized the legendary actor and director, a man whose films he had grown up watching with his father. The revelation left him both awestruck and uneasy. He respected Clint too much to let Rachel's behavior go unchecked, but he also knew how precarious his position was as a new employee. As Rachel continued speaking, Miguel tightened his grip on the bus tub he was carrying, debating whether to intervene. Clint, however, showed no signs of irritation. He simply listened, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Well then," Rachel pressed, her patience visibly wearing thin. "Shall I explain the menu to you? Slowly, perhaps?" The final word hung in the air, a thinly veiled jab at his age. Her words carried a smugness that made Miguel's stomach churn. Before Clint could respond, Miguel found himself stepping forward, his voice quiet but resolute. "Miss Rachel," he said hesitantly, "maybe I should get Mr. Thomas." Rachel spun around to face him, her polished composure slipping into annoyance. "Stay out of this, Miguel," she snapped. "Go bus tables. That's your job." Miguel froze, embarrassment creeping up his neck. Clint's gaze shifted to the young man, his eyes softening momentarily as if silently acknowledging the courage it took for Miguel to speak up. There was a quiet intensity in Clint's expression, one that Miguel found both comforting and humbling. Rachel turned back to Clint, her irritation now bubbling over. She gestured toward the group of tech executives, who were now whispering among themselves. "Sir," she said, her voice louder than necessary, "this isn't some diner off the highway. This is the Grand Oak. Our clientele expects a certain ambience, and quite frankly, you're not meeting it." Her words landed like a bomb in the once busy dining room. Conversations at nearby tables faltered, and a hush began to spread. At the table next to Clint's, an older couple, regular patrons of the restaurant, exchanged uneasy glances. The wife placed a hand on her husband's arm, silently urging him to wait. She recognized the look in Clint's eyes, the same look that had preceded some of the most memorable moments in his iconic films. Setting his whiskey down with deliberate care, Clint finally spoke. His voice was quiet but carried a weight that silenced the entire room. "In my day," he began, his tone measured, "places like this weren't about appearances. They were about respect." Rachel blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but she quickly recovered, doubling down on her stance. "Well, times have changed," she said, her tone bordering on exasperation. "This is a prestigious establishment for people who understand modern sophistication. Maybe this just isn't the right place for you." Nearby, Miguel let out a sharp breath, his chest tightening with anxiety. At the next table, the older couple gasped audibly. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point, but Clint's expression didn't waver. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. "Jerry," he said, his gravelly voice carrying effortlessly through the silent room, "could you bring me the ownership papers and the renovation plans? While you're at it." He ended the call and placed the phone back on the table, his movements deliberate and calm. The reality of the situation began to dawn on Rachel, her confident demeanor crumbling. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Clint met her wide-eyed gaze with the same calm authority that had defined his career. "You see," he said evenly, "I've been coming here every Friday for the past 6 months. Same table, same whiskey. Want to know why?" Rachel stared at him, her face pale. She shook her head faintly, unable to respond. "Because 6 months ago," Clint continued, "I bought this restaurant. Not for the prestige, not for the so-called modern sophistication. I bought it because this place used to stand for something real, a kind of hospitality that treated everyone with dignity, no matter who they were or what they wore. At that moment, Jerry, the restaurant's longtime accountant, appeared with a leather portfolio in hand. He nodded respectfully at Clint and handed him the documents. The dining room was silent as Clint opened the portfolio and laid the papers on the table for Rachel to see. The color drained from Rachel's face as the truth hit her. She hadn't just insulted a customer, she had insulted her boss, a man who had built his career on standing against the very arrogance she had displayed. Clint Eastwood remained composed, his steady gaze meeting Rachel's increasingly strained expression. "I'm aware of the prices," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the tense air. "And I'm well acquainted with the chef's reputation." His tone carried a quiet authority, the kind that came from decades of commanding attention both on and off screen. Rachel's polished exterior was beginning to crack. With a sharp, impatient flick of her wrist, she pulled out her order pad. The gesture wasn't just functional, it was laced with irritation. "Well then," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Shall I go over the menu? Slowly, perhaps?" She paused deliberately, her voice dripping with feigned politeness. "It might help if you need some time to catch up." At that moment, Miguel, the young busboy who had been silently observing from nearby, decided he couldn't stay quiet any longer. He stepped forward hesitantly, his voice steady but soft. "Miss Rachel," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe I should get Mr. Thomas." His tone carried a quiet warning, but it was clear he was also trying to protect her from herself. Rachel turned sharply, her composure crumbling further. Her eyes narrowed as she snapped, "Stay out of this, Miguel. Go bus tables. That's your job." Her words cut through the air, loud enough for a few nearby tables to hear. Miguel froze, his hands tightening on the edges of the bus tub he carried. But he didn't back down completely. His respect for Clint outweighed his fear of Rachel's disapproval. Clint watched the exchange with quiet interest, his calm gaze lingering on Miguel for a moment, almost as though offering silent encouragement. When Rachel turned back to him, her determination to assert authority was palpable. She gestured toward the nearby group of young executives, who were now watching the scene with barely concealed curiosity. "This isn't some roadside diner, sir," she declared, her voice rising slightly. "This is the Grand Oak. Our clientele expects a certain ambience, and quite frankly, you're not meeting it." Her words hung in the air like an awkward pause in a crowded room. Conversations at nearby tables slowed, then stopped entirely. At a corner table, an older couple who had been regulars at the restaurant for decades exchanged uneasy glances. The husband, clearly troubled by Rachel's behavior, leaned forward as if to interject, but his wife placed a gentle hand on his arm, silently urging him to wait. She recognized the look in Clint's eyes, a quiet, unshakable resolve that carried the weight of countless moments like this, moments where patience met principle. Setting his glass of whiskey down with deliberate care, Clint broke his silence. His voice, steady and low, carried effortlessly through the now quiet dining room. "In my day," he began, his tone thoughtful, "places like this weren't about appearances. They were about respect." Rachel crossed her arms, a defensive gesture that betrayed her growing frustration. "Well, times have changed," she shot back. Her voice was louder now, almost defiant. "This is a luxurious establishment for people who understand modern sophistication. Maybe this just isn't the right place for you." The impact of her words rippled through the room. Miguel, standing nearby, lost his grip on the bus tub he had been holding, and it clattered to the floor with a loud crash. The older couple gasped audibly, their shock mirrored by several other patrons who had been following the exchange. The room was now entirely silent, all eyes fixed on Clint. Yet, the man at the center of the storm remained completely unshaken. His expression didn't waver. His movements were measured and calm as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. Without so much as a glance at Rachel, he dialed a number. "Jerry," Clint said, his gravelly voice carrying an air of authority that silenced any lingering whispers in the room. "Could you bring me the ownership papers?" And the renovation plans we discussed last week. He paused, his tone unhurried. Yes, right now. Thank you. With that, he ended the call and calmly set his phone on the table, folding his hands in front of him. Rachel's confidence evaporated. The color drained from her face as she began to piece together the implications of Clint's words. Her mind raced, each realization worse than the last. This man wasn't just a customer she had deemed unworthy of the Grand Oak standards. He wasn't just someone to be dismissed or condescended to. He was clearly someone with far more authority than she had assumed. And then it hit her like a freight train. This man wasn't just a guest. He was the owner. Clint finally turned his gaze back to Rachel, his calm expression unchanged. You see, he began, his tone steady and deliberate. I've been coming here every Friday for the past 6 months. Same table, same whiskey. Want to know why? Rachel stared at him, frozen in place. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She could do nothing but nod faintly, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her order pad. Because 6 months ago, Clint continued, his voice carrying an unassailable weight. I bought this restaurant, not for the prestige, and not for the so-called modern sophistication you seem so proud of. He gestured subtly to the dining room around him. I bought it because this place used to stand for something real, a kind of hospitality that treated every guest with dignity. It didn't matter who they were or what they wore. It was about respect. At that moment, Jerry, the restaurant's longtime accountant, entered the dining room, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He approached Clint with a calm demeanor, nodding respectfully as he handed over the documents. Clint opened the portfolio and placed the papers neatly on the table, their presence a silent but undeniable confirmation of his words. The tension in the room was almost tangible. Rachel's face turned ashen as the truth sank in. She hadn't just insulted Clint Eastwood, one of the most respected figures in Hollywood. She had insulted her own boss, a man who had built his career. And now this restaurant, on the very values she had dismissed so carelessly. Clint's voice softened slightly, but it still carried the authority of someone who commanded respect. Mississippi, he said, his gaze steady. Let me tell you something. Real class isn't about designer labels or social media followers. It's about how you treat people. Dignity, respect, kindness, those are the things that matter. Miguel, who had been standing motionless, straightened slightly, his expression a mixture of awe and relief. At the table next to Clint's, the older couple nodded in quiet approval. Even the group of young executives who had been waiting by the host stand seemed captivated, their phones now forgotten. Clint leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Rachel. So, the question isn't whether I belong here. The question is whether you understand what this place really stands for. Jerry, Clint said calmly, his voice cutting through the thick silence that had settled over the restaurant. Can you bring me the ownership papers? Oh, and grab the renovation plans while you're at it. His tone carried no malice, no overt aggression, just a quiet authority that demanded attention. He ended the call, placed his phone gently on the table, and turned his gaze back to Rachel. You see, Clint began, his voice steady and deliberate. I've been coming here every Friday for the past 6 months. Same table, same whiskey. Want to know why? Rachel's face, now pale and tense, betrayed her growing realization. She opened her mouth, perhaps to offer an apology or a defense, but no words came out. The weight of Clint's gaze and his words rendered her utterly silent. 6 months ago, Clint continued, his tone deepening with a hint of nostalgia. I bought this restaurant, not for the prestige, not for the so-called modern luxury that you seem so fond of, but because this place used to stand for something real. He gestured subtly around the dining room, his hand sweeping over the polished tables and the glimmering chandeliers. It was a place where every guest was treated with dignity, no matter who they were or what they wore. That kind of spirit of genuine hospitality, it's what made this place special, and I'll be damned if I let it become something else. At that moment, Jerry, the restaurant's seasoned accountant and one of Clint's most trusted advisors, appeared at the edge of the dining room. In his hands, he carried a sleek leather portfolio. Without hesitation, Jerry crossed the room, nodding respectfully at Clint before placing the portfolio on the table. Clint opened it with a practiced ease, revealing neatly organized papers that bore his signature and the restaurant's official seal. He didn't push them toward Rachel. He didn't need to. The mere presence of the documents was enough. Rachel's breath hitched. Her mind raced as the reality of the situation began to take hold. This wasn't just any customer she had insulted. This was her boss, and not just any boss, but Clint Eastwood, a man whose very name was synonymous with integrity and strength. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her, each realization heavier than the last. Clint turned his attention to Miguel, who stood frozen nearby, still clutching his bus tub. "This young man," Clint said, his tone softening, "understood something you didn't. Respect isn't about appearances or status. It's about how you treat people." His words carried a warmth that seemed to cut through the tension in the room, offering a quiet encouragement that Miguel could feel deeply. Miguel blinked in surprise as Clint addressed him directly. "How would you like to start training as a waiter?" Clint asked, his gravelly voice carrying an unmistakable sincerity. "We need more people like you, people who understand what real service is about." Miguel's eyes widened, and for a moment, he simply stared, unsure if this was real. Then, with a voice thick with emotion, he managed to say, "Yes, sir, I'd love that. Thank you." Clint gave him a small, approving nod before shifting his gaze back to Rachel. His expression wasn't harsh, but it was firm, steadfast in a way that left no room for doubt. "As for you," he said, his words deliberate and measured, "you have a choice to make. You can walk out of here and find a job somewhere that values image over substance, or you can stay, learn from Miguel and the veteran staff, and figure out what real hospitality is all about." Rachel's hands trembled as she clutched her order pad. Tears welled in her eyes, and her voice wavered as she finally spoke. "I'd like to stay," she said quietly, the words barely above a whisper. If you'll let me." Clint studied her for a moment, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Good choice," he said simply, leaning back in his chair and taking another measured sip of his whiskey. As if on cue, the older couple seated at a nearby table began to clap. Their applause was slow and deliberate, filled with a kind of quiet appreciation for the lesson they had just witnessed. One by one, other patrons joined in, the sound of their hands echoing through the dining room. The applause wasn't for Clint's celebrity status, it was for the values he had upheld. It was a celebration of respect, humility, and the enduring importance of treating others with dignity. Rachel stood frozen, the applause washing over her as if it were a wave she didn't know how to navigate. Miguel, now standing a little taller, offered her a small, encouraging smile. For the first time that evening, Rachel returned the gesture, albeit faintly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the clapping subsided and the restaurant gradually returned to its usual hum of conversation and activity, Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Thomas," he called, addressing the restaurant's longtime manager, who had been standing at a respectful distance throughout the exchange. "Put Miguel in charge of her retraining." Thomas nodded immediately, his face a mix of relief and approval. "Of course, Mr. Eastwood." With the atmosphere finally easing, Clint calmly finished his drink, the amber liquid catching the soft light of the room. Rising from his chair, he smoothed the fabric of his casual polo shirt with deliberate ease. Before stepping away, he placed a firm yet gentle hand on Miguel's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a passing of trust, and an encouragement wrapped into one simple act. Miguel's chest swelled slightly with pride, the validation evident in his widened eyes. Clint then turned to address the room, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the dining hall with a steady authority that commanded every ear. "Let this be a reminder," he began, his gravelly tone resonating with a sense of wisdom earned through years of experience. "That true class isn't about what you wear or how many followers you have. It's about how you treat the people around you, with respect and dignity. That's what really matters. Never forget that." The sincerity in his words seemed to linger in the air, resonating deeply with those in the room. Heads nodded, some patrons exchanging thoughtful glances, while others wore faint smiles of approval. For those who had witnessed the evening's events unfold, the message struck a chord, far deeper than any lecture or written policy ever could. Clint's unhurried steps carried him toward the exit, his presence commanding as always, but not in the ostentatious way one might expect from a Hollywood legend. Instead, it was a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you've done what's right, not for recognition but because it's the right thing to do. The slight creak of the heavy restaurant door punctuated his departure, and then he was gone, leaving behind a room that felt fuller than before, not because of the food or drink, but because of the values he had reinstilled. That night, the Grand Oak didn't just protect its reputation, it transcended it. Patrons walked out into the crisp evening air with more than satisfied appetites. They carried with them a story that would linger in their hearts for days to come. It wasn't just a story of a celebrity moment or a lesson in humility. It was a reminder of the enduring importance of character and kindness in a world that often values appearances over substance. For Miguel, the night had been nothing short of transformative. As he continued clearing tables, the weight of Clint's gesture stayed with him, a silent promise that hard work and respect still mattered. The veteran staff watched him with approving eyes, some offering subtle nods of encouragement, knowing that the young man's journey had only just begun.